Let me welcome everybody again. Broadcasting from Los Angeles, California. It's just past 9 a.m. I know we're live on Facebook also. This will be recorded and available from the First Principles of Movement website. There'll be a link to a YouTube channel. All of the 6 prior webinars are all there, and I'm really pleased to have such a strong and consistent following attending these high-value prehab rehab for musculoskeletal problems and musculoskeletal health series as we explore the constraint of telehealth together. We've been talking a lot about the person-centered approach as opposed to the trainer-centered or clinician-centered approach, and how when we guide by the side and we're not seeing people in person, a couple of wrinkles occur. One, people are obviously not able to ask us to do the typical gadget man type of stuff where we're fixing them and playing the Batman role. Instead, we're having to put on the Alfred hat and guide by the side, which is helping build autonomy. And it's also building people's confidence, because usually their expectation is that they need us to put an elbow in their QL to mobilize a joint. And lo and behold, what people are finding is that they're more resilient and robust than they had anticipated. And we're getting lots and lots of questions from trainers and clinicians about this phenomenon. How is this so? Why is it that they're responding when we're not policing perfection, when we're just looking at a 2D image, et cetera? And I think the second thing that we found is that people who often are suffering from nocebos, such as hearing about a scan finding of a rotator cuff tear or a herniated disc in their low back, or discovering they have a torsioned pelvis or leg length inequality or other movement dysfunction, and have a certain amount of fear avoidance. Now what we're able to do is find a safe baseline to give them efficacious training to start to build them up gradually, kind of following Tim Gavitt's sports science approach of it's not the activity that broke you down, it's the activity you weren't prepared for. So now we're addressing the upstream sources. So we've been dealing with the fear avoidance that people have with respect to movement and activity, and B, the sense that people have that they need somebody outside of themselves to either fix them with some sort of passive manual therapy, or B, watch over them like a hawk and judge every movement to see if it's the correct movement. So we're learning that actually people have more ability to self-regulate. And that's a big subject for what we're going to be addressing today, is this self-regulation. First, before we get into auto-regulation and guiding by the side, it's always nice to start us off with a little bit of real world COVID activities as people embark on home exercise. Sure looks like a good squat using the heavy band. Oh well, not such a good idea. Holy cow. I hope he survives. So we're seeing, along with the obvious follies that are out there, and perhaps the reason why it's good to have a good online coach that you can trust to program for you, we see a lot of changes that we're well aware of. Here today, we're showing 2 pictures from India. And on the top right, you see a view of the Himalayas from Kashmir, a war-torn area suffering from endless battles between Pakistan and Indian nations over who has the right to this beautiful, pristine natural habitat and region. And bottom left is Mumbai. And we see that supposedly for the first time in many decades, the pink flamingos are flocking again to the water outside of Mumbai. So as people have slowed down, so there's been some amazing things occurring, some good and some not so good. Here we see a closed exercise area in Sydney. Hopefully that'll be opened up soon. So Nick and I have known each other for a long time. Nick Winkelman was an Exos coach for many, many years and has made presentations for my groups there. I've hosted groups there thanks to Mark Verstegen since 2000. Originally, I was invited by Ken Crenshaw, head athletic trainer with the Arizona Diamondbacks. And Mark was grateful enough to let us use his facility, which was at Arizona State University back in the day. It was called Athletes Performance then. But subsequently, Nick joined the cadre of amazing, amazing coaches who have emerged through the Exos ranks. And I want to welcome Nick, who's now with Ireland Rugby. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, Craig, it's an absolute pleasure. Anytime I get to chat with you and your following is always an honor on my end.
So we're going to do a deep dive into a variety of topics, and we're going to let Nick riff over the next hour and a half. I'm going to try to set the stage for some things since I've got control of the slides that are some of my favorite topics. But Nick and I have shared a lot of time at Perform Better as well as at Exos and talked about things from his wife's work with handicapped and the horseback riding, the bareback riding next to Exos, and how she perceived developmental things while we were over at Exos doing a lot of DNS type of work. We've talked a lot about gamification, and we both share a love for the motor learning literature and skill acquisition work, starting with a deep dive into Gabrielle Wolf at UNLV and some of the contrasts between the value of internal cues and external cues, blocked and random practice, constraints-based motor learning, and the like. So we're gonna get into quite a bit of this, but first a shout out to Nick. Congratulations for this amazing looking book. I see you got a video here. Tell us a little bit while you're flipping through the pages there about what your goals were with this book.
Yeah, it's interesting when you sit down to write a book. You've done it a number of times. It's an overwhelming proposition, but my goal was very, very simple, if I was to put it into one line, and that is to help the movement profession elevate how they coach to the same level as what they coach, simply put. And just to zoom into that one level deeper, when I say the what, I'm thinking of program design, reps and sets, exercise, the physical sciences of physiology, anatomy, biomechanics, kinesiology, all the things that for the most part we can touch, we can feel, we can see, and let's say we can engage with in a concrete way. I can write down 3 sets of 10 and I can write down the exercise name squat, and then I can see the physical squat take form in front of me. But as we look at that, not to contrast it, but to relate it to the other key part is how we translate that. How do we get those ideas off the paper and into the person? How do we get those ideas out of our head and into the movement of the client or the patient we're supporting? And so for me, I've spent the better part of 15 years thinking about how we coach, how we translate the what into movement in the achievement of movement goals. So the book examines that 1 inch wide and infinite miles deep, and specifically looks at language and communication from a coaching and an instruction standpoint. And it basically tells the story of how our words impact their movement, providing models and heuristics and examples for the reader to use along the way. But more than anything, I've written the book to help change behavior, that literally in the way that it is designed, from the second it starts, it invites you in with thought experiments, micro examples, to learn about attention by testing your own, to learn about memory by testing your own, and then to learn about cueing by assessing yourself, and then starting to build this skill, to inevitably getting to the end of the book, which has some amazing imagery that captures all of these cues in live action stills. But hopefully by that point, my goal is that you don't need the imagery, because the concept, the tool, the fishing pole, so to speak, will have already been built. Wow.
All right, let's dive in. Holy cow, I'm excited. So this story about how words impact movement, and even how words can interfere often, is something which I've been looking at since Professor Yonda first introduced us to subcortical training. And he didn't talk about it a lot, but he was clearly a student of Feldenkrais, and less a student of a lot of the other neuro rehab schools of thought like Bobath, et cetera, who broke things down into parts, thinking that then the person would recapitulate the patterns on the back end. And so we see how Yonda's work was erroneously the forefather of a lot of corrective exercise systems by accident, because he taught how to assess movement patterns and identify faulty movement patterns, which naturally people just assumed, okay, if you have a faulty toe off in the terminal phase of gait during propulsion, obviously they're not extending their hip. Well, we sit all the time, and Professor Yonda says there's certain muscles that are prone to tightness, like the hip flexors. So we've got to loosen or inhibit the tight hip flexors to turn on the glutes, so you get normal propulsion during that 10 degrees of hip hyperextension at the terminal phase of gait. And lo and behold, after we went down that rabbit hole, and you see how even Gray Cook pays homage to Yonda in the first few paragraphs of the book Movement, we now realize on the back end that we really weren't watching what Professor Yonda was doing. He never gave voluntary exercises. He didn't cortically cue things. He created a gamified environment with fun toys where people learn to do fundamental movements like squats and lunges, and he upskilled them almost like John Wooden would through the choice of his drills. And I think that so many misunderstandings like that have permeated not only rehab, but also the coaching space. So to have you here, we've both done a deep dive on these things. To be able to chat together is kind of cool from my standpoint. Anybody who has any feedback about the program, feel free to email me at craigliebenson.dc@gmail.com. As I mentioned, you can access the video for not only this, but also the prior programs with Professor Mosley, Rachel Balkovec of the Yankees, Peter Stillwell, chiropractic PhD in Canada, Matthew Lowe, physical therapist from England. You can access all of the prior videos on our YouTube channel, which is linked to at firstprinciplesofmovement.com. And you can see my other handles there as well. One of the things I like to do is I like to make sure that we're all on the same page. And there are many wonderful theories. There are so many great theories out there, and the theories can be hypotheses that later get tested. We've talked a lot about science. We've talked a lot about finding the minimally viable product by testing for failure, by seeing if our theories hold up. And I'm reminded of this tweet from Matt Ray. I'm very familiar with what's been done in the past. I'm just not married to any of it. So his approach is very much like Stephen Jobs, of thinking outside the box, of breaking the box, and avoiding the dogma of the herd mentalities that drive us to want to do the popular or the trendy, rather than questioning things, not like a cynic, but questioning things in a skeptically optimistic manner, where we simply just want to know. We want to learn from our mistakes. And Nick, can you speak for a moment about your journey? So you told us about the product, the evolution, where you're at now, and the book, but can you talk a little bit about your journey and maybe how Mark Verstegen really imbued you with this, we heard Rachel Balkovec mention it, a no guru mentality?
Yeah. So, for me, I'll go back a little bit farther than Verstegen, because again, as Gray paid homage to Yonda, I definitely want to pay homage to the key influencers for me. And so I think when it started, I was in college getting an exercise science degree, and I was going through this personal training certification course. And it was just an in-house certification course to work at the local rec center. And there was this very charismatic personal trainer who taught it named JC. And like most individuals coming through an S&C degree or becoming a personal trainer, you do some level of shadowing or mentorship. And so he was the person that I would follow on the training floor. And following him on the training floor, I didn't find there to be a lot of differences between how he programmed. In that, in terms of his clients, and obviously programming is always client dependent, he was doing all the same things. He was bench pressing on Monday. There was buys and tries at the end of the workout, right? It was a lot of beach body type stuff, but still he was very different. And I noticed that a lot of the amateur bodybuilders from around Corvallis, I was at Oregon State University, would come to him. And what I started to realize is what separated him from many of the other trainers and even sport coaches who I had worked with in the past was, yes, his charisma and his energy. He was committed and passionate about this. I just spoke to him the other day, in fact, after the book came out, and his charisma is as high as ever. But the key thing was his language. He was so purposeful in what he said to people. He would take this moment right before they move as if to protect it, as if it was something sacred. And he would always select his words with great precision. And at the time, I just thought this was how he coached. I didn't think anything of it. But as I watched him longer and longer and longer, Craig, I inevitably realized there was something really special about what he was doing. I knew it had to do with communication, but I didn't know how to capture it. I couldn't put the lightning in the bottle quite yet. And a mutual friend of ours, who I know you know, Guido van Rijsegem, who was also at Oregon State University at the time, I remember going up to him, and he's from more of an athletic training, sports therapy background, but we worked with him on the return to play athletes and clients, so late stage rehab, if you would. So he was quite integral during my development as well. And I said to him, hey, listen, I think this communication thing, this cueing thing is really important. I mean, gosh, we do it all the time, but this guy over here is doing it different than anyone I've ever seen. And I recall, I think it was 19 or 20. And I said, I'm going to write a book one day called The Form Within. I said, I don't know why, but I just feel that this is important. And so this was, a long time ago at this point. And I parked that idea because, let's be honest, before you can focus on how to coach, you need to know what to coach. So I was still in the midst of consuming the kinesiology, the biomechanics, the athletic body imbalance, the yonda. I was consuming all the what, as I referenced earlier. But then fast forward, it's now 2009, I believe, and I've just taken over the NFL Combine program from Joe Gomes, and then prior to him, Darryl Leto. Two of the best strength conditioning coaches I've ever known in my life, two of the best speed coaches I've ever known. And so I was taking over their program, meaning they had written the program. The athletes coming in, if you're not familiar with the Exos Combine Development Program, were 30 of the best athletes coming out of college into the NFL. The vast majority of them were already going to go first, second, or third round anyway. So I'm stressed to no end, but I'm driven and excited by this opportunity because frankly, I'd been working for it since I'd started when it was still called Athletes Performance. And so 2009, I take over the program. And here's the key thing people have to understand. The facilities we had, top notch. The program was written by some of the best strength coaches in the world. Year one, I was simply trying to not screw it up. And so I coached to the dotted I and the cross T. I sweat the details, and I made sure the athletes sweat the details in the process. I was coaching before, during, and after every single repetition. I mean, there was not a moment where I wasn't trying to bring surgical precision. And while I still had remembered all of these things around the importance of communication, I was so focused on the program, so focused on the piece of paper, I only in time realized that I had lost sight of the person. And so I tell this story in the book, but it was late in January during that first year in 2009. And it dawns on me, I'm coaching this session and I am literally cueing in my mind perfectly before, during, and after. But all of a sudden in my mind's eye, I look up and it's as if I see the athletes for the first time, like truly see them for the first time. And I realize that I'm talking, but I'm not seeing anything happen in front of me. I'm just yelling out cues that sound good in my head and frankly probably were pretty good, but I wasn't being cognizant of how many. I wasn't being cognizant of when. I was using a blanketed approach. Any error that moved, bang, 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 I was shooting it with a new cue. So there was no continuity and consistency with how I was deploying language. It'd be like going into the gym and just having a free-for-all, doing random exercises with no coherent consistency and thought in why you were doing what you were doing. And so this dawned on me late in January, about halfway through the process. But at that point, it was just a feeling in my gut. I knew that something had to change, but I wasn't ready to change it right there. So that was like that second key moment. I locked that in, and I get through that 2009 combine. Now, we go to Indianapolis in late February, and like anybody, I was excited. This was a big, big moment for me in my career. These 30-some players were about to run live on national television. And say what you will, the 40-yard dash is the pinnacle thing at the NFL Combine, and we're hoping that these guys maximize their performance. And while at the end of the day, the Combine is not going to make or break a draft status, it can get a team to take a second look. So was it important to the player? Was it important to the agent? Yes, it was, because it's an important interview question, so to speak, to answer. So I'm sitting there on the couch, and I'm watching my guys run. We're in a hotel ballroom 200 meters away from Lucas Oil Stadium. And I have my pen and paper out from the results that we had assessed at Exos. And then I had my video that I had taken. So I have all this information ready to go. And so I watch over 4 days all of my guys run. And when I get back on the plane to head back to Phoenix, I am pissed. Now, I'm the only one who's pissed, because did all of them run faster? Yes, they did. Was it high fives and hugs all around? Yeah. Was our average improvement from pre to post on par with my predecessors? Yes, it was. So people are like, why are you upset? It's your first year. Way to go. But I observed something critical. And it, at that moment, gave me the insight of what I had seen and what I was worried about on that January morning. And that was this. The technical changes I had observed when the players were with me in Phoenix and the performances they had achieved were better in Phoenix than when we got to Indianapolis. So something had happened between when they got on the flight in Phoenix and landed in Indianapolis, and I'm like, what is it? The reality is they ran faster. So the physical work that we had done, the upgrade to the car, had worked fantastic. But I realized that what had fallen off, what had changed, was not the physical change to their body, but their technique, their coordination. If you would, the driver in the car didn't seem to be as skilled in Indianapolis as they were in Phoenix. So guys who had learned to get long out of their stance were flexed once again. Guys who had learned to drive down underneath them were casting out once again. And it was like everyone had reverted to type, and they were back to Bambi on ice. But because all that physical change had taken place, that's what they were able to bank on and leverage to improve performance. Because the reality is, if you do anything long enough, you will get better at it. But in my mind, we had left money on the table. We had left critical change on the table. And ultimately, what I realized was the key difference was me. I wasn't there whispering cues into their ears. I wasn't there reminding them. I wasn't there giving them the 10 rules to live by to run better. I realized I'd become some kind of an extension of their memory. And so all that teaching that I had done, that I thought had manifested in learning, hadn't yet. They did not own the change. The change was still owned by me. I had not come up with the way to bridge it into them. And ultimately, it came right on back to what I said, when I said it, and how often I said it. And most certainly, Craig, you know my background. I study constraints. I study environmental shifts. But so much of what we do to build up and break down comes out of this thing here, our mouth. And oftentimes it will do far more damage than it does good if we're not aware of how to use it as a precise instrument to affect change. And so ultimately, at the end of 2009, I was a bull in a china shop. I was consuming every book I could get my hands on that could explain what I had observed and what I felt. And it landed me smack dab in the middle of motor learning and their 8-syllable words. And I was committed to first own it for me and my players, but then own it and share it with the world. And while it's not called The Form Within, the language of coaching is the birth of those ideas 15 years later.
Wow. So we're going to talk more about that and the way to get that upgrade to stick, and how a lot of times we do all the right stuff and it doesn't stick because of, as you're suggesting, you weren't seeing what was right in front of you. You were saying all the right things. The program was correct. The what was correct, but maybe the relatedness wasn't there because you weren't even establishing that full connection with the athlete, that reciprocal relationship, to help them to see the why behind the what, so that it could be something that they could access later on an involuntary basis when they're under stress. And I know you've talked about stress and how we revert to defaults under stress because of the way we're wired. So we've got a couple things to get through here. This is a little journey that we'll be going on, and we'll probably spend more time on the overcoaching phenomenon and how to mitigate it than all of the other ones possibly even put together. So I remember a Perform Better talk from you, What We Say Matters, full house, a lot of reputable people there listening at Perform Better. And then of course at Exos where you spoke, and I just want to drop a little video here from your presentation with us, Nick.
Think about the complexity it has to go on, from autonomic nervous system control to the joint health, to neuromuscular control, high level to local control of all the systems in the body. There's no cue that could ever capture all of that.
So this idea about cueing and the complexity of movement and the fact that there isn't a cue that can upgrade that speaks to me, for me, to what you're saying about the value of communication, and something Mark always talked about, Mark Verstegen, the athlete-centered approach, knowing the person, learning about the person, that humanity. And we've done a deep dive into this with Peter Stillwell, who in the rehab space and in medical rehab, we have what's called the biopsychosocial approach, which has helped us to see outside of just the pathology or the diagnosis to the person. But even the biopsychosocial approach, as it supersedes the biomedical model, we can get siloed into just the psychological or just the social or just the bio and lose the fact that really those are islands in a sea, and the person is in that ocean, in that water. So they're everywhere. And the athlete-centered approach of Mark at Exos, to me, speaks volumes to what you were inspired through bearing witness to at Oregon State, and with your work with Guido, and has become manifest in what you're doing now. Words matter. And again, it bridges the gap from coaching to the clinic. When somebody hears they have a wear and tear syndrome, and they should avoid things that hurt and let pain be their guide, when in fact, how could they have a wear and tear syndrome since they're sedentary? Words matter. When you tell somebody they have degenerative joint disease or a narrow spinal canal, and you don't tell them that, well, there's also a false positive rate for these same structural findings on a scan on people who have no symptoms whatsoever, nor do these things even predict outcome or prognosis. We're actually burdening people with the nocebo, where they now start to take on the fragilista mindset. These classifications, labels, telling somebody they're bone on bone when they actually still have some cartilage, as Pooley says, these words tend to decrease a person's perceived control over their pain as well as their self-efficacy. And who needs self-efficacy, confidence that they can succeed, more than an elite athlete? Who's dealing with more stress than the people, and I know Jim Kurtz is here from Seattle, welcome Jim, the Seahawks. I mean, when a team has been to the Super Bowl, when a team has been champions, they're fighting for their lives out there. As Pete Carroll teaches, every blade of grass. There's no stone unturned. It's aggregation of marginal gains. If somebody lacks confidence, they can't help you. If there's a player, to your point about what you were learning early on from Guido about return to play, if there's a player who doesn't feel confident that their knee will hold up, if they're worried about an old hammy, that's going to be an emergency brake on their performance. So what we tell people, both in training as well as in the clinic matters, we want to avoid anything that would slow them down. In a nutshell, what slows people down are overly protective labels. Telling somebody they have spine instability, an unstable knee, telling somebody that they have degeneration, telling somebody that there's a equal correlation of pain with damage, telling somebody they're out of alignment. Think about Usain Bolt. If we look at his sprinting, we don't see this synchrony, especially getting out of the blocks. He's got a leg length inequality. Are we going to correct those things? So let me throw it to you, Nick. When you're faced with one of your rugby athletes and you see somebody that has imbalances, how do you thin slice the tipping point of where you'll intervene and what you'll leave alone?
I'd love to answer that, but can I comment before on your connection between language and limitation?
Yes.
And so I think this is so important. You talk about first principles, and so I knew we'd be able to get down to some bedrock. And if you don't mind, I'd like to get down to some bedrock here. So stop me if I go too deep, but I'll try to keep the language simple and fresh. And that is this. Let's try to understand for a moment why language can move us and lift us up, but also bury us and take us down. And so when we look at language, let's go right back to the very beginning. We're not born with it. Okay, so no one comes into this world speaking a language. And that's by design. That's by design. We can learn any language, and many people can learn multiple languages. So it's an interesting phenomenon that we can learn language at all. So how do we communicate? How do we engage? How do we understand our world, if not with words? Well, we know very, very early on, but obviously throughout life, it's our senses. We understand the world as we do young and old, but most notably when we're young through our senses. So we can see it, we can touch it, we can hear it, we can feel it, so on and so forth. So let's take the example then of a child learning about a dog for the very first time. And if you think about it, there will be a very first time a person deals and interacts with anything. And so early on, they cannot say the word dog, and they don't understand the word dog when spoken to them. But they start to accumulate in motor learning what we call a representation of a dog. And that representation is filled with all the senses. It's like it becomes a high definition video that is literally etched into the neurons of the mind. So I can see the dog, I can feel the dog, I can smell the dog, most notably when it comes out from the rain. I can feel the rough tongue of the dog, and if it licks my toes, I know that it's going to tickle me. I can hear the bark, high piercing versus low and broad. And so I gain all of this sensory richness. And then inevitably, as my language system comes on board, I learn that this thing is called dog. And if I want to point at one, I can yell the name dog out to mom and dad, and they'll probably laugh. And if I have one at home, I might be able to learn that dog is called Mango, which is the name of our dog here in Ireland, our English Bulldog. And so when we look at the word dog, and then for us, the specific one, mango, hiding inside of each of those words, just let this settle in, hiding inside of each of those words are the real life, there it is, real life lived experiences that are etched into our senses, right? So words only mean that with which we apply to them. And so every word is etched into the mind in a real life sensory signature, okay? And that's why we say words move us. That's not a figure of speech. It is quite literal. Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me is a load of you-know-what. Words absolutely can hurt individuals because words manifest in mind, body, and emotion in a literal way. And that singular example is important. Now, let's take the word dog and scale it up. In my family, we are dog people. My wife rescues animals. And so with my two children, they have been taught on how to approach a dog, how to deal with a dog, especially one that might be aggressive. And every single one of those experiences is coded in positivity and productivity to know how to deal with that animal. But you can imagine a mother or a father who had had a tragic incident with an animal. Possibly they were bit when they were young. So they've never had animals in the home since, and they will not have an animal, will not have a dog. And thus when their child, 2.5, 3, approaches a dog for the first time, they scar them, literally, by yelling and screaming and having them come back. So that person starts to generate a representation of the word dog that in their sensory treasure trove, their sensory box, has a negative coding. Whereas with my children, it has a positive. That's why certain people react differently to the exact same concept. Okay, so what we've done there is a very rudimentary upskilling to know how words are connected to body. Now let's take it forward to this example. When we then look at how words are processed in the brain, it should come as no surprise that action words, words related to human movement, notably verbs, right? Verbs are action words. They provoke, cause, instigate movement. Action verbs are processed in the same portion of the brain that's in charge for bringing those actions to life. So action words related to the lower body, kick, walk, step, run, sprint, are all processed in part within the primary motor cortex related to lower limb function. Equally, if I say lick, eat, suck, grab, grasp, punch, push, so on and so forth, upper body or facial, mouth-related verbs are processed in their portion of the primary motor cortex. So literally, when we hear a word, the part of the brain that is responsible for bringing that word forward into real life with all the senses and proprioceptive tools required to do so are also activated. So when we talk about words physically changing us, physically moving us, let it be said here, it is not a figure of speech. It is a lived reality. So let's take it forward one final level. Language related to pain and injury. We know because of the research from Rob Gray out of Arizona State University with elite baseball players that after return to performance, this means they're playing, athletes that have had ACL injuries and have since recovered, so hitters, and pitchers who've had UCL injuries and have since recovered, when we probe their attention in a naturalistic way, they pay more attention to their injured area than they do when compared to an elite equivalent who is not injured. And so when we look at hitters, their ability to know what their knee is doing naturalistically, or pitchers what their elbow is doing naturalistically, is higher in those that have a prior injury than those that did not. And I'm happy to share this paper with Craig to distribute. And so what does that tell us? It tells us something we already know, that when people are injured, they tend to grab and already focus on that injured area. But then to your point, Craig, if we bring additional language on top of that, how's your knee doing? Is it painful? It's bone on bone. Even if we don't add a negative context and prognosis to it, we're dumping more fuel on the internal micro minutia focused world this person is already in. And so by the very nature of it, we're teaching them to micromanage what should otherwise be one joint in a symphony of joints that produce a movement, reinforcing why, as early as we can, when we return someone to perform, in the world of Feldenkrais and in the world of Liebenson, we need to be thinking about the macro. Because if we focus on the micro, healthy or injured, we sacrifice the macro. And that needs to be imbued in the way we design our drills and in the way we craft our cues and our language. And then coat that with appropriate representative positivity increases the self-efficacy and the desire to keep going. Okay, so I do apologize if that was a little long. Hopefully that was a coherent stream of consciousness, but I just want to start to lay the groundwork here that this is why I'm so passionate about language, that when I started to study it, my intuition said it was important. But if you go back to first principles, language emerges from the physicality that is the human body. We then use language to re-engage and communicate with the human body, but we have to use the right type of language.
Beautiful. Holy
So let me
cow.
pause there. I know you had a question, but is there anything that provokes that we want to get into before I answer your actual question, which was a far simpler one on the rugby player?
No, let's hold the rugby player and the tipping point, because I have a video coming up where we'll be able to dive back into that. That was
Okay.
perfect timing, because we're about to talk about these issues of micro versus macro management and the danger of micromanaging, as well as the merits and virtue of coding things with positive coaching. So those things are coming up. So you've set the stage perfectly. Here's another brief video from one of our Exos meetings with you.
All light up the same brain centers. But if I give you some abstract concept, you have to think about 3 ways to Sunday, it's not going to drive a visual image. But here, my friends, is the holy grail that I'm going to finish on with one slide. Analogies. I'm going to get.
So I know we can't get too far into this discussion about language and movement without your ultimate thin slice, which is analogy. We're going to talk a lot more about it, but I just wanted to get that out there. Do you want to make a few quick points just to anchor that?
The reality is analogy. Analogy is a comparison between something we are familiar with and something we either are not familiar with or less familiar with. And so I'll give an example. My daughter, she was, couldn't have been more than 2.5. We were digging around the garage, and we kind of had this bin full of different balls, different sports balls. And I picked one out, and when kids are young, you kind of introduce them to things for the first time. Obviously, it's an intuitive thing to do as a first-time parent. And I said, "Hey, honey, this is a soccer ball." And she says to me in her little cute voice, "Oh, kind of like a basketball." And so just, for most, that would have been a fleeting moment, just gone. But right then and there, my 2.5-year-old showed, and I think they've shown it as young as less than 1, that this associative ability, the ability to scaffold learning by using past experiences to better understand the present, is categorically how we learn and how we add to this memory bank, so to speak, of what feels like infinite experiences we can log with inside our cranium. And so when we talk about analogy, even for those listening right now, all 235 of you, as Craig has been talking, and as I've been talking and others will talk, I guarantee that ideas have popped into your mind. Experiences. Oh, this is kind of like that. Or, oh, pictures. This makes me imagine that. Or Nick talked about his dog. Oh, I remember my dog, Fido, whatever it is. Well, in every single one of those moments where I say something that you're obviously familiar with, and that triggers something new, this new thing emerges in your mind. That, by definition, is analogical reasoning. That's analogy, and you can't hide from it. You can't hide from it. It is omnipresent, ever present. Even when we analyze linguistics in a forum like this, I will be using 5 to 6 analogies a minute in normal human speech. And I would argue, if you think about how you would coach a 5-year-old versus 10, 15, 20, 25, up to 50, the biggest difference in your communication is your use of examples, which, put differently, is use of analogies, the comparisons you make. I might go all superhero with a 10-year-old, but for one of my 25-year-old athletes who wants nothing to do with superheroes and is all about the X's and O's, that's not going to resonate with him. So analogies, by their very nature, allow us to use a person's past to help them better understand the present. And ultimately, as coaches, it is our job to know the person, to interrogate and sample their past, so we can get the raw material to improve their movement future.
Wow. It just goes to highlight again how important it is to build trust with somebody, to build that bridge through the relationship so that they feel that you have really learned about what's important to them. And I know, again, Mark impressed on me a long time ago the deep dive into somebody's KPIs, their key performance indicators, learning about their training past, their injury past, their career goals, where they are in their career, what sort of training programs they've had, what sort of rehab treatments they've had, how their sleep is. The more we learn about the person, especially the relatable goals they have and their relatable concerns, then we're able to get more buy-in when we start to see something anew that maybe is a fresh perspective, a fresh take that they hadn't thought of before. Whereas if we come at them with our fresh take, like we're a know-it-all, without ever making that connection and building that trust, I don't think that you can possibly have that person fully commit to the program you're putting in place. I was reminded when I learned about Mark's approach to KPIs of what I learned from Dr. Carol Levitt in Prague about the importance of taking a history, the importance of hearing a person's story and letting it breathe, not rushing through it. In most orthopedic circles, they never even hear the story, the orthopedic surgeon. It's a nurse practitioner. It's a physician assistant. The surgeon won't even see the person until they have a scan, and then they're only talking about the scan and their symptoms. And Dr. Levitt, I think, said it best. He goes, he who treats the sight of symptoms is lost. And more tragically, so is their patient. So we want to get to know the person who has those symptoms. We want to treat the person, not just the scan or the pathology. And this isn't just about words. This is about language and hearing people's use of language as they express to us their story, and then them hearing us reflect it back as proof, as evidence that we actually listened to them. So in empathy or in motivational interviewing, you first want to listen, and then you want to demonstrate that you heard them by repeating it, and go even one step further in motivational interviewing. We want to seek confirmation. Did I get it right? Is there anything else? Is there more? Is there more? Guido talks about this. He's always asking, Guido Van Recycum is always asking, are you sure there's nothing else? Just to forge that bond. So I think we'll get into this positive approach to coaching more. Here, I think this image is just saying what you've already told us. The best cues hide technical info in a short phrase that puts a picture into the athlete's mind. I just love your emphasis, Nick, on analogy and pictures. And what you said about children is something that when I was first in China, they talk about, again, the same principle, that the way children learn is initially obviously not through words. It's through what they see through their senses, especially the eyes. Humans, unlike your dog, Mango, or my dog, Harley, who are very olfactory. Most other primates are olfactory. Apes have a big snout. Humans are more visual. Our main predator was the venomous snake. We had an arms race with the snakes. And so our visual cortex is much bigger. And that goes to your whole argument for why analogy is so important. Visual images are so important to the hominoid, to Homo sapiens, because this is how the brain mushroom clouded. There was an arms race with snakes, and we had to learn to detect the threat in our midst, the snake in the grass, if you will, that was hidden, that was camouflaged even. So imagine that whole evolutionary process. It's quite fascinating. And now we see, and here's just a cartoon, we see how it is that we've gone so far away from the way in which we actually learn movement. So this is a picture here of what happens when the cognitive gets in the way. Somebody's thinking about moving. What do they say? If you think, you stink, or paralysis by analysis. And I think we're trying to shift away from this as fast and as far as possible. So now to come full circle with what you've been saying, here is an actual quote from you saying what you were alluding to before about the dangers of micromanagement, or in the context of corrective exercise, of policing perfection. Would you want to work for a micromanager that didn't set clear goals? Probably not. However, this is exactly how we are managing our athletes' motor systems every time we cue using overly technical internal cues that are void of a clear external goal to be achieved. So this is the person-centered, athlete-centered model. Even Dr. Levitt echoed this when he said, don't try to teach perfect patterns, correct the key fault that's causing the trouble. So the trouble is, I want to be able to get out of the blocks faster. I want to be able to change directions with more aplomb. I want to be able to brake hard like a hockey stop and shift gears. I want to be able to trust my leg more when I'm getting tired. How I perform, like Buddy Morris says, under times of fatigue is what really will distinguish the great from the merely good. So do you want to come back to what you were saying before about micromanager and close this learning loop?
Let's go back to first principles here that I think can shed some interesting light around what sits behind a quote like this. And also remind me, if we can get to it later on, around the importance of listening to your client's story. I have a story for that I think illustrates your exact point. And so to illuminate this first principle here, and I talk about it quite extensively in the book, and it's probably one of the more difficult concepts to convey in language, but I'm gonna do my best here, and I'm gonna do it through an example, through an analogy. And that is, when we start to look at motor control, the purpose of it is in the name. It's to control the motor system. It's to control movement. And I think if we understand how the motor system is controlled, it starts to shed light on how we can assist it in controlling movement better. And so let's take, for example, your moving house, and you're packing everything up, and you have boxes that have different labels on them. And so one box is labeled kitchen pots and pans, and another one is labeled bed linens. And you didn't know this, but your partner is the one that filled them up, okay? And your partner didn't see the labels and inadvertently put the bed linens inside the box with the pot for the pots and pans, and put the pots and pans inside the box that said bed linens, okay? And so you walk up to the box that says pots and pans. Well, let's just go on implicitly with what we think is happening. Right now, your mind is establishing your intention. Whether or not you know it, the second you read those words, pots and pans, the intention behind what the motor system is going to have to do is very different than picking up a box that says bed linens. It's the difference between seeing a dumbbell that's 5 pounds and one that says 50 pounds. The intention of what you're getting ready to do is very different, okay? So what does that tell us? Well, intention, our goals, drive the resources the motor system deploys to achieve those goals, okay? If you would, the neural signatures, the activation patterns, the synchrony of the muscles, so on and so forth, things that everyone on the call, I'm sure, is familiar with. So now you walk over to that box that says pots and pans, you squat down with your good form or not so good form, doesn't really matter. You grab the box and boom, you shoot up. Well, why? Well, in your mind, now your intention was just to pick up the box, but behind that was this prediction of what was going to happen. And that prediction was, I'm going to pick up a heavy box. But when you picked it up, that prediction was shown to be wrong, was shown to be an error. And likely the next box I go to pick up, which happens to be the linens, I might be a little bit cautious, and logic might say, oh, possibly these got switched up, and I take a more advisable approach. My intention, so to speak, has been upgraded, and I'm safer, I'm slower, and I gradually rise as I pick up the linens box. So what's going on here? When you have a goal, when you have an intention, the way that intention turns into movement is through what we call forward prediction. And I'm gonna put this in very crude terms, but basically the brain predicts what that movement is gonna feel like from a proprioceptive perspective. So proprioceptively, is it gonna be heavy? Is it gonna be light? Is it gonna be fast? Is it gonna be slow? Is it slow then fast? Does it have a rhythm change? And there's more complex words we could use, but that's what I mean by forward prediction. It predicts what's gonna happen. And when that prediction turns out to be wrong, you get this error, and that's where self-correction comes in. That's exactly how kids learn to ride their bike. And so in the case of picking up the box, it illustrates this, that your intention was something was heavy, your body deployed a movement outcome to achieve that. And then you just so happen to be wrong, and you're a bit more cautious the next time. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the goal, the mental goal, the mental intention dictates or tells the body or gives the body the indication of the movement assets required to achieve it. I'm going to say it again. The intention that we set, which is what cues are. Cues set the intention of the mind. So the intention set by the cue helps the body develop the sensory motor blueprint to achieve that goal. Put in an analogy, when you go into your car, what do? You put an address in your GPS. But then what does the GPS unit do? It calculates the process of getting you there. You are naive to whether or not you're about to go left or right. Your only job is to put the right address in the GPS unit, okay? So here's the punchline. Our job is to put the right address in the mind. Our job is to put the right intention and goal in the mind. So the second we start saying things like, I need you to squeeze your glutes, but the person's about to sprint or jump or lunge, you have now put the address for your next door neighbor's house when you meant to go 2 hours down the road to the beach. And now there's this conflict. Like, well, do you want to go to the next door neighbor's house, or do you want to go to the beach? Do you want to squeeze your glutes and extend your hip, or do you want to coordinate the whole body and jump? Now, the reality is our brains are quite clever. So we don't literally just think about the glute. But what the person has to do is go glute, jump, and switch between them. Well, there's a reason people have now written books called The Myth of Multitasking. Your attention cannot entertain two things in a simultaneous moment, which means we have to put greater attentional load, switching between micro, macro, and macro. And we can get into some of the details of what this does at an actual neuromuscular level. But the net outcome, especially for complex movement, is you've set the wrong goal. You've set a micro goal when you should have set a macro goal. You put linens in the box that said pots and pans. And ultimately, it drives error into the system, and coordination is ultimately what suffers. But guess what, my friends? The body is doing exactly what you asked it to do. It takes your goal of squeezing the glute and says, fine, we will prioritize that and all the neuromuscular outcomes associated with it above coordinating the entire jump or the sprint. And so this is the first principle of motor control that sits behind this quote. And ultimately, if you know that first principle, you don't even need to read the research on internal and external cueing, because the answer to why external cueing is better is in the motor control research at a fundamental bedrock level.
All right. Let's let that sit for a sec, Nick. That was powerful. I love that. And I've noticed that in your work, the finesse by which you navigate some of the dichotomization that's out there now about internal versus external cueing is underscored in what you're telling us now about micro and macro management. I didn't quite see how you meant this issue. I'm going to skip forward just for a sec and then come back to this video of Dan Paff. But of course, here we see, it's, everybody a golfer plays with has the solution for their duck hook or their slice. And, your coach is the one who knows you best. And can you keep all those voices out of your head? How do we maintain that continuity and get that buy-in so that people stick with the metaphors that we know are most robust to withstand the stressors of choking, for instance, and not just follow the fool's gold of some short-term fix that might work on the third hole when you're with your buddies. Eventually, it's going to bite you in the butt. But I want to go back to the point we were talking about before with economy of cues and making the decision from an architectural standpoint about what a person can handle. There are different personalities. There are individuals who are full of fear let's say they're chronic pain patients, or there's a lot at stake and they're fearing choking, let's say. They're fearing the past. They're anxious about that. Or somebody who we can distract them from negative performances by putting positive thoughts in their head. Somebody who's more intellectual, who can handle a certain cortical cue, or somebody who's a visual learner, or somebody who's a kinesthetic learner. Dan Paff, who I know you know quite well, here was asked a question about the precision and personalization of cues and thoughts, and how to arrive at an appreciation of how to navigate that uncertain terrain. So I'm going to let it play, and then I want to hear your thoughts about this.
And then how much time is spent, like, is all year, is it like a coordination and a how you're running focus, is that through the whole year? Or like as you get like really close to an event, is it more just, are they always thinking about form?
Depends on the individual, depends on the problem. Some people can handle monitoring, some can't.
Right.
So certain times of the year, say I'm OCD, well, I probably don't want to monitor too many things if I'm in competition phase.
Yeah.
But like a lot of field eventers, they can juggle 3 or 4 balls in their event. So like on a long jump, they may be able to monitor what they're doing at the start, something in the middle of the run, something at takeoff, something on the landing. So they can juggle 4 balls, and it doesn't really interfere. And it's how intense is the monitoring. But I've had world-class long jumpers, they can juggle 1 ball. Like if you talk about something over here, everything else goes to shit. This is perfect, but everything else looks like they've never been to a track meet.
Right.
So a lot of this is how do they manage self-talk? How do they manage kinesthetic monitoring? Art of coaching, do you know what to monitor for that person? Like what's the worst virus? Like you can see 50 things wrong, but if you find the right virus, maybe 40 disappear because that virus is the trigger for 40 other things.
Yeah. Right.
So, Nick, thoughts?
So Dan and I, as recent as 2 days ago, one, we have a very good relationship built on mutual respect. I mean, for me, he's one of the forefathers in what we call strength conditioning and movement skill development. And so you're right. You use this idea of finesse in the way we treat internal and external cues, which is more to say, are you focusing on moving the body or a body part, or are you focusing on the outcome the body is trying to achieve? And it's like we look at these as a dichotomy, but rather they describe area on a continuum. And categorically, there are different types of external cues, and then analogies broaden that further. And categorically, there are different types of internal cueing. And so it's interesting that Dan uses the word monitoring in the way he's discussing. And funny enough, though, if you do look at a lot of the choking research, which is primarily done in baseball and golf, they talk about self-monitoring as being a underpinning feature of choking in competition. But even as Dan says, different people can handle different levels of self-monitoring. And I think most certainly different sports, by their very nature, probably allow for different levels of self-monitoring. In the long buildup of a long jump, as he's referring, is very different than the half a second of throwing or trying to hit a baseball. So I think in terms of the cognitive real estate available for self-monitoring, context as well as individual matters. So let me just start with that. But one of the biggest challenges I had in writing this book was how I was going to deal with internal language. Because on one hand, I know that in my bones, because I've been coaching for over 15 years and people who do fast things, so I was quite certain around my practical intuitions and experience, but also academically. I mean, getting a PhD, not because I wanted to be a researcher, because I wanted to understand this so deeply that I could be authentic in the way I echoed it into the world. I still knew that there was a role of internal language. I still knew that we had to be able to talk about the body. And it's not a matter of internal versus external, but rather when do you use internal and when do you use external? And for me, it has less to do with the characteristics of the person, albeit I'm going to clarify what I mean by that in a moment, but it has more to do with the temporal nature of coaching itself. And that is, if I'm trying to build up knowledge structures, and that, Craig, if I'm working with you on a golf swing for the first time, and I think this is pronounced in injury rehab, I come in and I've blown out my ACL and I've done the initial stages of rehab, and now I'm starting to move again. And I'm starting to do the movements, the hopping, the landing, the change of direction that was the underpinning feature of the environment and of the movement that caused it in the first place. There's a lot of uncertainty around that. So early on, I think it's important to say, Craig, we're about to go through a hopping activity. This hopping activity is going to be very low threshold. You're not going to have to go very far, very deep. And it's simply going to require you to flex at your hip, your knee, and your ankle. What I'm doing in that discussion is I'm trying to increase your awareness cognitively of what we're about to do. And I'm trying to decrease uncertainty. I'm trying to manage your anxiety and your stress levels. And so by giving you that information, using internal language to the degree that it is required, for me is perfectly fine. And I call that a movement description in my model in the book. But following that, I might say, now, to do that, to perform that movement for this first repetition, as you sit down, I want you to imagine you're sitting and just touching a high bar stool. We're not dropping down to sit at that chair at the table yet. We're just dropping down to the bar stool. And then as they progress, like, okay, now I want you to sit down a little bit deeper. Now we're sitting at the kitchen table. Drop down and hit that kitchen table seat for me. See, what I've done there is I've given them a real life analogy, very visual, that changes the parameter of pattern through the parameter of height. But I don't tell them any of that because I've given them a simple visual cue that is going to start to control the key feature of the movement for me that is most important for safety and early success, which is how deep they go and how they control at that depth. I might be wrong there. I'm making that up, but I'm trying to illustrate a point. And so every time I use internal language, I always have a partition between the internal language and the movement. And I call that partition an external cue or an analogy. And so I say that because early on, Dan and I, back to Dan, we would talk about the merits of internal and external cueing. And he understands and values external cues, but he said it himself there in the video that he knows certain athletes need to be able to monitor. And so what he's talking about when he says monitoring is monitoring their body. He says it himself, kinesthetic sense. And it took me years to get to this thought, but I believe I understand where Dan and I have inadvertently disagreed in the past on the merits of internal language. And let me try to explain that. There is a difference between intentionally controlling the body and being aware of a body that moves. I'm going to say it again. There is a big difference, a chasm of difference between intentionally trying to control knee range of motion, actively control dorsiflexion, actively try to control spinal position and hip flexion, where that becomes my goal because that's the cue. That is very different than if, Craig, I say to you, on your next repetition, I want you to monitor your foot contact off the ground. And I want you on a scale of heavy to light, I want you to be able to tell me at the end how it felt. Or, hey, on your takeoff for your lead hip as it blocks forward, I want you to tell me at that high position, does it feel loose or does it feel locked? And so what I'm doing here is, Craig, I'm not asking you in that case to control how you push off the ground. I'm not asking you to control how that hip blocks as you take off the board. I'm asking you to be aware of what happened so that we might be able to have a discussion to see how your subjective experience maps to objectively what I have observed. Now, a hardcore bench scientist might say, Nick, those are both internal cues. But I would argue that the negativity associated with internal language is in the top-down intentionality of using internal language to drive the macro of a movement. For me to be aware of something, Craig, it must already have happened. For me to be aware, by definition, the action I am aware of has already occurred. So by asking you to be aware of something, I'm not asking you to overtly control it. I'm simply asking you to monitor how it felt, how it came into this world. And the language I oftentimes use, and I would argue that the language that Dan Paff would use is a lot of adverbs or action words generally. Light, fast, heavy, light, tall, short, loose, stiff, so on and so forth. And when we then peer into that, do I still think that awareness of the body, especially as the complexity of the movement and the speed of the movement increases, do I still think body awareness can get us into some trouble? Yes, I do. But it goes back to Dan's point. I think some people can benefit from that scan or that selective scanning more than others. But let me be very clear. I do not believe or compare body awareness, which is something that happens after the fact, to the intentionality associated with internal cues. And this is where, Craig, I believe more evidence, more research needs to be done. So hear it now. Internal cues, by Nick Winkelman's definition, are top-down intentional efforts to control part of the body. Body awareness, the sense of a body that has already moved, I do not believe categorically should be in the same house as internal cues as I just defined it. I believe there's a benefit, albeit that benefit needs to be researched and likely, to Dan's point, is based on movement and individual.
So in effect, this occurs almost in a debrief. And I know Dan talks a lot about the importance of debriefing. So it's a post hoc to analyze at that point. But to your point, in the moment, in the heat of battle, we need to have something that's more resilient, that's less analytical. The analytical, the cortical isn't going to hold up.
No, and he says it himself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a footnote in there. But did you notice when he talked about the body scan or the monitoring of the long jump, he noted very specifically that if they're doing multiple things, it's not multiple things at the same moment. They might monitor on takeoff, early phase, late phase, and maybe hitting the board. By the very design, we could say similar in the 100-meter, by the start, early, mid, and late race. What we know about attention is it's when you ask attention, entertain multiple ideas simultaneously, that we get into trouble. So for longer sequential events, can we give 3 cues? Sure, as long as we have built the knowledge structures that they are deployed at specific time points. And those have been earned through experience. When we go to a sport like baseball, could we ever have multiple areas of self-monitoring? Unequivocally, no. It's too fast. And that's where the sport and the opinion of the coach come into play.
Brilliant example. I love that. Here's another video from Exos.
You know, if you count backwards, you're using working memory. You're using conscious focus, which means if your learning is still stuck at the explicit centers, and I ask you to count backwards, it's going to mess up your shot. And guess what happens? Analogy group has no change in performance. Whether or not they are counting backwards, they shoot the same accuracy. But the second you ask the explicit coach group or the control group that coach themselves to count backwards, massive degradation in accuracy and performance.
So I want to show a picture here, and I know your wife does a lot with children, handicapped children, or did, and bareback riding for that sensory motor connection through the environment with the horse as a way to help them with neurodevelopmental issues. here's a great example, I think, of somebody's ideas about in a horse, how the horse can respond to different constraints deployed by the coach. And if I just read it for everybody, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts. When I switched from coaching humans to horses, I mourned the loss of explicit instruction explanation. But today I believe it was a gift, forcing me to stop relying on telling. But I had to also resist replacing words with physical manipulation. So she's describing how the ecological approach to motor learning and skill acquisition was a lifesaver for her. So what does that trigger for you, Nick?
For me, it's about better cues and better constraints. It's not about cues or constraints. And this is why there's a little bit of a dichotomy emerging in the area of instruction versus ecological design, or instruction versus constraints. And I'm here to level the playing field and say both are always at play, whether or not you want them to be. Now, we're not dealing with horses, we're dealing with humans. Humans have heads, they have brains, they have cognition, they are thinking, whether or not we are advising them on how to think. Let us be very clear. And so it is all about creating clear minds and clearer environments with which that body and mind can interact. And so when I see this, what I love about what I'm trying to promote as just an echo of the literature and lived experience is this, that when I have a drill or an environment where nonverbal is at play, and I allow, as I say, the environment to do the talking and the athlete to do the walking, I'm using the environment to change intention. And I'm going to say that again. I use the environment to change intention, because the second I change environment, I change what's on offer from a visual, kinesthetic, sensory perspective. And the second I change those circumstances, I have to shift my intention to overcome the movement problem I am facing. So let's take a classic one we see oftentimes these days in running, and notably popularized by Franz Bosch. Very rarely are you going to see a sprint session done in any pro sport where there won't be dowels. There'll be dowels around, and people will have this dowel on their shoulder, and they are running with no arms. Now, you feel like, why do you do that? Well, when I take arms away, something fundamentally starts to happen. I don't have the rudder, if you would, to counterbalance what the lower body is doing. So now the trunk has a natural sway associated with it. Any asymmetries in the lower body, because I can't counteract them with my arms, start to come into the fore. And so I get new sensory information from the body and the environment. And once I get that new sensory information, what can I do with it? I can start to self-correct, as Dan Paff was talking. Now, to put this in different terms, think about it for those of you who are listening. Have you ever had the athlete say the following? I know what you want me to do, I just can't feel it. We've all heard that. We've all experienced that for ourselves. So one of the great things about constraints, right? I don't know who popularized this idea. It might have been Gray Cook. We have to feed the error. And when we say feed the error, we're simply saying, how do I turn the sensory signal up on the error? But when I say turn the sensory signal up, what do I want that to do? I want you to become aware of it. Let's call a spade a spade. I turn the sensory signal up so your cognitive brain says, that doesn't feel right. Let's go through this subcortical self-correction until it does. Beautiful. So dowel on shoulder causes people to self-correct higher posture, tends to lift higher in the hip because of increased stability, better force production through the ground, less casting out, bada bing, bada boom. I would have had to deploy 10 cues to piecemeal all that together. So congratulations, Franz Bosch. He has come up with brilliant ways to nudge the body by typically taking body parts away, i.e. the arms, to allow other body parts to self-organize and come to the fore. However, is it enough? Is it enough? For me, it's not enough. Why? Anyone and everyone I've known who uses constraints They know that they can only take the person so far. And some people have very stubborn movement patterns. And a constraint isn't always the best negotiating tactic to get through there. Some people need a little bit more of a direct approach. So if ultimately I constrain the body to increase the sensory signal for you to become aware of it so you can deploy corrective strategies, hold on. This thing was still involved. Of course it was. So rather than using a bottom-up approach where I use the environment to change your focus, guess what I can also do? I can change how you focus on the environment. I'm going to say it again. Just as I can use the environment to nudge your focus, I can also nudge how you focus on the environment. So the cool thing about external cues and analogies is they don't teach you to micromanage your movement. They teach you to interact with the environment better. And if I can get you to interact with the environment better, you'll be able to extract the right information from that environment to self-correct and change. That sounds an awful lot like constraints to me. So let's use the tangible example of sprinting. I have someone who is not getting enough knee lift. I try the dowel, it's still not working. Craig, I've worked with you. You look at their hips, like Nick, they got plenty of range of motion, no issue there. Spine, fantastic. Talk to the strength coach, plenty strong enough. So it is clearly, it's not a mechanical car problem, it's a driver problem. And so I'm like, okay, the dowel's not working. Well, here's what I can say to them. Have you ever run upstairs before? Sure, of course I have. Awesome. When you run upstairs, what do you have to really focus on doing that you think is similar to this sprint out here? I got to get my legs up. Yeah, sure. If you don't get your legs up, what's going to happen? Well, I won't make the next stair, especially if I'm taking them 2 or 3 at a time, and I'm going to fall on my face. And do you fall on your face? No. Why? Because I get my legs up. Beautiful. Okay, on this next sprint, as you pass that 20 meter, I'm going to yell one word, stairs. And when you hear me yell that word, bam, 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 start climbing, start climbing. But here's what I've done there. I haven't told them how to flex their hip, their knee, and their ankle, just as the dowel hasn't told them how to flex their hip, their knee, and their ankle. I created a mental constraint. Because what is running upstairs in real life? We'd call that a constraint. I call that a cue if running over flat ground. What's the difference? There isn't one. So cues are mental constraints that teach me how to focus better on the environment. Constraints create mental cues by shifting the environment directly. My friends, they are one and the same when you understand the first principles.
I love that. So really, this is about a higher gig resolution image through the cues that creates the idea, the construct in the mind of the environment, even when the environment is absent.
Bingo. And it's infinite. And that's why I've spent so much time on analogies in the book, because that creates the one-to-one ability to create all these constraints that the mind can craft in a second, but you can't always necessarily craft in the literal.
Beautiful. And you're not going to have that environment to constrain you to root out your tendencies when you're on the field of play or in valued life activities.
And that's what has been one of my biggest points is cues can travel. Cues are companions, especially the right ones. But constraints are not. You got to leave your constraints at home. But when I'm cueing you, I can cue within the authenticity of the real movement I'm looking to nudge. The second I bring in a constraint, I have to take you a little bit away. And then I got to hope it bridges back. The cue is done on the platform that you need to perform in.
So let's take this into another realm. So we're talking a lot about performance, and you've worked in the combine and with MLB guys in their off season, et cetera. Now with rugby. I want to bring Ryan into the conversation here. So Ryan's in New York City. He's working with a lot of people that are desk jockeys. Many of them are also weekend warriors. They're trying to maintain their youthfulness, trying to develop healthy longevity. Ryan, can you speak for a minute about in the non-athletic population, how the constraints and the drills that you deploy in the gym, you hope that they will transfer into the valued life activities in your clients?
So that's an interesting question. I think initially I think I was a lot like Nick, where I was just trying to build up the what, as in the biology of the body, building the strength, building those qualities. But I realized over time that what I should have been doing the whole time was teaching them, I guess, more transfer. I wanted to teach people maybe how to move in a way that's more translatable to their life. And in the gym, that's what we try to do with the exercises, you know, squat, lunge, hinge, push, pull, carry. We think a lot of those things carry over to their lives. But I think it's really interesting. This kind of occurred to me that since we switched over to telehealth and we're working with people now away from the gym itself, and we're working with people in their own homes, I realized that what you guys have been teaching me is that I actually didn't do so well in those arenas, because that all kind of went out the window. As soon as I'm not there, they can't do it without me, which is just how it's my misunderstanding of this idea of motor learning. And really it was just motor control. I was using these exercises to get them to move a certain way, but it just didn't carry over, because now I have to reteach them. As soon as I'm not there, they're not getting it done. So I think in the rehab space with the average persons, it's now the focus is really teaching people how to be independent, know how to do these exercises and movements so that they can be really training themselves and being active themselves. But I got some work to do there. Like they're so dependent on it, you know, myself and the coaches.
Well, I'm gonna skip forward for just a sec, Nick, to show a couple examples that I've been showing over the last few webinars. These are in China, where I don't have the benefit of language. And so obviously I can't correct, I can't tell them what to do. So I might give a visual, I might demonstrate what I want, and then see what they do. Inquire of them to please show me a high plank. And so this is typically the type of pattern that we'll see, or position, if you will. And I've realized that all I have to do is give them a literal picture. I don't have to even give them an idea of a picture, a literal picture of themselves, and they'll go, oh my gosh, I can't believe that that's what I did, that was my representation. And I show them with the iPhone what the audience is seeing, and there could be a few hundred people in the room, and they autocorrect. They self-regulate like that. And this happens over and over again, thus demonstrating the power of a picture. This is the before, and that's the after. And look at the robustness. You can just see the pillar is working here. The glutes and abs are working. The uprightness here, the stiffness of the torso, whereas here he's sagging. And then again here, and we just show the image and they auto-regulate. So the ability of people through what you said before, the debrief. In this case, the debrief is happening in real time. I'm showing them something, they're absorbing that, they're interpreting it, they're going, oh my, that's what I looked like? But we didn't have to say tighten your core, brace, hollow, pelvic tilt, lengthen even. We were able to avoid some of the errors that in this quote, in Franz Bosch's book, Gab Wolf talks about. So I want to go back to this for a sec. Precise movement correction by coaches and physical therapists or rehab experts, for instance, during trunk control exercises. So we all immediately have images of what we're talking about here, PRI, DNS, whatever system you're talking about, are thus not so much a sign of professional expertise as a sign of ignorance about how movements are controlled. Well-intentioned but misapplied expertise can often be highly damaging. So Gab Wolf, no less authority than Gabrielle Wolf from UNLV, who's done more of the research on what Ryan, you were talking about as far as the transferability and how we learn to throw a dart more accurately or to jump higher or to see a ball and hit a ball. She's done the meta-analysis. She's had more of the papers in the meta-analysis. The scoreboard in favor of what you're talking about, Nick, is overwhelming. We're talking 99% of hundreds of studies highlighting not that precise movement correction is wrong, just that it needs to be embedded in an ecology that's more in line with this. And before I ask you to chime in, Nick, I've just been informed that Kathy Sierra, who is the person responsible for this tweet, is here in the room. If Kathy has a question, can you please forward it? We'd love to hear your comment or your question. While we're waiting for that, I'm actually going to see if I can unmute her. I want to welcome a number of people here that are from all over the world. I see that our faculty member from Seoul, Hong Jin Kim, is here. I mentioned Jim Kurtz is here from Seattle. Jackie is here from Shenzhen, China. Of course, we have people from New Delhi, India. Vipal Dogra, Justin Trott from Singapore, Nick Sams from Thailand. Marco is here from Slovenia. Tomas is here from Switzerland. Graham from France. I mentioned Jackie Shu from China. Roel Jacobs is here from Belgium, and Graham Allen from England. So many people. Ben Stevens is here from Canada. Ryan Luster from Italy. The great coach out of Orange County and a great dear friend of mine, Brennan Gassamian, is here. So many people from all over the world. But I'm going to see if I can unmute, if I can unmute Kathy. And Nick, what are your thoughts while I'm looking for Kathy?
I think the work that Kathy's doing, actually, I'm so happy she's on here. She's been such a supporter of my work and others, and I find her approach, bringing it to animals, is so unique, but also relevant to me, as you've noted, because my wife is a therapeutic horse riding instructor. So that's so great that she's on. No, listen, I love and everything you're saying resonates with me. The one thing I'll say is this: it's not a cookie cutter approach. Everything we're talking about still requires finesse. That's why the half of my book is spent on not convincing you of external cues, but how to create better ones. To try to explain, as you noted, that external cues are, let's say, on par or on average better than internal language doesn't take much word count to do that. Get into a bit of motor control, bit of attention, bit of memory, and there you have it. But understanding how to craft external cues and craft analogies, I'll be honest, that's where most coaches and trainers and therapists struggle. They take a courses that I run and say, Nick, I get it, I love it, but how do I do this in real time? Ryan, just like you mentioned, when you watch your clients, over video at home, they all seem to revert back to type. That's like the story I told. My athletes had reverted to type. So how do we get them to own the process? Well, for me, it's a matter of trying to get them to own the language, thus own the intention that leads to the change. If they can do that, then truly learning has occurred. As Wooden said, I have not taught until they have learned, and learning requires them to leave with something, to own something that does not any longer require our presence. So that would be the key thing for me. So as much as we're trying to talk about first principles in a practical real life scenario, it's a matter of how do we bring those into the fore and be able to adapt our language and adapt the environment to the people in front of us. That's the ultimate challenge, and the one I'm looking to be a catalyst for change around with the language of coaching.
Wow. So I was successful. Kathy, do you have any points for us about what you're learning from horses and how that can inform us and inspire us about how to pivot with humans?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you. Welcome.
Yeah, well, I'm still kind of in shock, but to see my picture there. Some of you may have seen this before. This has literally saved the lives of some of these horses. I mean, unlike human athletes, if a horse loses performance or has seems to have a neurological problem, right, they'll often be euthanized. And so these horses, and that's why I really came to it for the first time, is because I had a horse where it was life or death. And now 10 years later, we call him the Benjamin Button horse, because he just seems to keep getting younger every year as a result of this. But Craig, I especially have a question for you. Well, both of you, two questions. The first one is why, when these findings are so robust about all of this, and especially just looking at the, internal versus external cueing, why is there still so much resistance to it? And the second one is, I'm finding that it's so much focused on the athletic side, and or then suddenly over here we have the rehab side, but I see that as just one continuum, and that division seems to be kind of, I don't know, harmful or blocking progress, where for me it's just all one continuum. And that was one of the first things I noticed, is that I started this just to do rehab, but before long the horses were so thriving under this that they were performing in ways that nobody even thought possible.
Wow.
And that's it.
Wow, it's a pleasure to have you here. We've been talking about the status quo bias and the problem of vested interests, and we're seeing it with COVID-19 in the rehab space. This idea about creating a safe environment for people that challenges them at the edge of their capability, to give them a positive experience with movement, and change their mindset to make them more failure tolerant, and help them to see that they can have more confidence in valued life activities. This was being noceboed. It was being torpedoed by the fix-it mentality of manual therapy and corrective exercise. So manual therapy is invaluable. Corrective exercise has a role, as Nick was saying. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But as Gab Wolf is pointing out, we're pivoting because we've realized now the value of guiding by the side. And when you guide by the side, you empower people. And what's more valuable than empowering people? The people come in to see us, they have goals. If it's in the clinic, it's not to be disabled by their pain. It's to have hope for their future. So we want to give them tangible hope and an achievable plan. And achievable would be the metric that I'm thinking in terms of. It has to be realistic. It has to make sense. So there is a cortical component, like Nick is saying. We're not eliminating the cortical component, but it's got to be relatable. That's such an important concept to me, is building the trust. So you have found you can build the trust in the horse. You can empower the horse. You can build confidence in the horse. We can do the same thing with all of our athletes and our patients. And it does follow the same principles. Safety, like Maslow teaches, and then challenge. If we don't challenge people, they don't change. There's no adaptation. So when we overcorrect, we take away the challenge. When we isolate things and break them down into parts, it doesn't transfer. It's just fool's gold, which is the problem of overcorrections. The adult is not a big baby. So I'll use floor work, groundwork, like a jiu-jitsu artist, but I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of finding harder and more novel things on the ground. I want to get them upright. I want to see how they function in a unipedal way, in a multiplanar way, where they're dealing with gravity and controlling their center of mass over their base. So for me, I feel it's absolutely common principles. We've found a GPS. We found that if we can reassure and reactivate and build resilience and use variability, which, as Guido van Ryssigem, Nick's friend and mentor, said is the oil of the central nervous system, we can promote people's ability to learn how to be more agile under stress. And to Ryan's point, telehealth has constrained us in a way that has fast-tracked knowledge translation and changed the behavior of so-called movement professionals more than dissemination of all of the information and evidence and literature ever could have. And what's holding us back, to your point, Kathy, again, it's vested interests, it's status quo bias, it's fear of failure. Rachel Balkovec talked about the growth mindset as one where we have tolerance for failure. We need to be able, as I said in the beginning, to not just step outside the box, but break the box. It shouldn't be about doing what's popular. Pavel Tsatsouline talks about what's popular on his podcast with Joe Rogan. He says, leave your correctives outside of my gym. They may have a place. He's not saying abandon them, but when you come to get strong, we're going to challenge you. We're going to create an environment that pushes you, and we're going to program it in such a way that it's safe and sustainable. But the correctives can end out imprisoning you as far as your potential, and derailing that process by weighing you down, because they take too much of your reserve, your mental reserve. You invest too much in the foam roll and in all of the low load activities. So your question about what's holding us back and this whole spectrum, this gets to the heart of what we're doing in all of these webinars. And I'm just tickled that you're here. I had no idea you were here. Nick, you should make some comments. And I have to say that we haven't gotten through the first slice here. And while you're making your comments, Nick, I would want to throw out a question to you. Matt Lowe, a great critic of motor control, is from a historical standpoint, wrote a viewpoint for the Journal of Orthopedics and Sports Physical Therapist, and was my guest a few weeks ago. He's coming back to talk about motor learning and motor control next Sunday. The week after, Rachel Balkovec, who's with the New York Yankees now, and the first female strength and conditioning coach in professional baseball, and a big proponent of the senses, starting with the eyes and vision for hitting. She also fell victim to what we're falling victim to today, Nick, where we're having such a deep conversation that we're only touching on all of the areas I wanted to cover. So she's coming back in 2 weeks. And I want to ask you if you would consider, you don't have to tell us right now, coming back in 3 weeks, which probably will be our final webinar. It'll make 10, because I want us just to be able to milk this and not rush through any of the other slides. So you can just think about that while you're responding to Kathy's point.
Yeah. Well, consider it a yes. It would be
all right.
This is what I do. It wakes me up in the morning and keeps me up at night. Nope. Consider that a yes.
I
Craig,
can exhale.
as long as you'll reciprocate, which I know you will, and pop over on my side, and I'll ping you with the questions.
Thank you. So your thoughts.
So Kathy, to answer your very well articulated question, and again, while we have you on, just thank you for all that you do and all that you share. You do it unselfishly with such a positive heart, and just that I also love the visuals. We've been talking about visuals, and you do such a good job of bringing pictures to life alongside very eloquent posts. So thank you so much for what you're doing. You could equally be sitting here and likely should during one of these. So thank you. Insofar as your question, I agree completely on the continuum side of things. Movement is movement is movement. One of the reasons that attentional focus and external focus in particular is so interesting to me, and why I'm so passionate about it, if not overly passionate at times, is they've shown the principle, whether it is lab-based to complex movements, whether it's open or closed skill, young or old, able-bodied, those with physical and or possibly mental disabilities, the external focus effect, which is simply to say to put your intention on the ultimate goal, effect stands true. And I do believe with time, it will establish itself as a principle as firm as gravity. And you can quote me on that, but more research obviously is to be done. Insofar as why it's not fully accepted, I'll be honest with you. Prior to inviting Gabrielle Wolf to speak at the NSCA Arizona State Clinic in 2009, not even 11 years ago, she had never spoken at an S&C clinic before in her life. She's now gone on to speak at Nike and various other areas, and I am by no means taking credit for that increase, but I think we are early in translating this research to the real world. She wrote a wonderful book in 2007 called Attention and Motor Skill Learning. I cannot recommend it highly enough. I give thousands upon thousands of words to building that book up and respecting it as it should be respected in my own. But my book, The Language of Coaching, is really the first to try to translate decades and decades of motor learning research on linguistics and instruction into a language that all movement professionals, young, old, new, and experienced, can bring to the fore. Insofar as then, the uptake, another point is this: it's a failure of omission. It's, as Craig has said, we started off with the concrete, the tangible, the things we could see, touch, and experience, the human body, biomechanics, kinesiology, anatomy. And ultimately what happened is we confused the text in our biomechanical textbook for that with which we should communicate movement to our clients. It was a failure of omission. And thus it is our job now that we know this, and everyone that does know this, to spread these words in their own practice, quite literally and figuratively, but also to the rest of the world, because this is a hole that we are slowly filling. And webinars like this will accelerate that filling. But I believe we're in an early adopter stage. Academic institutions, professional development certifications need to take this on board, and it needs to be more than a 2 to 3 slide footnote. It deserves its own module, it deserves its own course. And that's why I keep harping on elevating how to the level of what. And why for the resistance? Well, why resistance in general? It is called change. People do not like it. We are asking them to unlock and open up something they do every day, all day, but have never considered for a moment. And by the way, we're telling them possibly they've been doing it wrong, or at least off. That's hard for people to swallow, which is why we need to go about this with great empathy, great understanding, and great patience. And that's why it's taken me 15 years to inevitably produce a book. But I believe I've written a book with empathy, patience, and understanding, which is why chapter 7 in my book is called Roadmap. It is an entire chapter on behavior change, not athlete behavior change, coach behavior change, because that's what we're up against. And that's difficult. That's why there's resistance. But when met with empathy, understanding, and education, change will come.
Wow.
Thank you.
That's
Thank you
amazing.
both so much. And
You're
thank you both
Thank you
for
coming.
being so brave.
I think Nick said it best. He got his PhD because he just wanted to learn. And the learn it all attitude is something which requires that sometimes we have to go mea culpa and say we had something wrong. For me, my allegiance to motor control was something that I had wrong. And I've learned, as I go back into David's work and others on ecological validity, just how much the environment that we set up, and the environment isn't just the physical environment, it's also the safety net, it's also the dialogue, it's the relatedness and the trust, and the goals, that helps create a receptivity to change in the person we're working with. And in terms of the coach, I mean, you just said it best, Nick. It's not just about the athlete, that we want to change the athlete or the client or the patient who's a victim of all the nocebos and give them empowerment. But it's also all the people in this webinar who are here to change the mindset of coaches and clinicians so that they're more comfortable guiding by the side. And I've unmiked Brennan Gassanian. So Brennan, can you, I just want to check that you're here. Are you able to speak for a second?
Hey, Craig. Yep.
So Brennan is a dear friend and coach and actually colleague of Stan Ward, who's quoted here with the quote, guide by the side. Brennan is a Tier X coach with Equinox in Orange County. And I appreciate so much that you're joining us. You've always come to the meetings at Exos. You've come to the meetings in Los Angeles when another former great Exos coach, Nicole Rodriguez, has taught with me at UCLA. You're such a great educator and example. And I think, Nick, you talk about empathy and this chapter, chapter 7, and the roadmap. And it makes me think that empathy is the foundation. It's where somebody knows we're listening to them and we're meeting them where they are. But the roadmap suggests that it's not just about giving people tangible hope. It's also about giving them a meaningful plan, a sensible plan that relates to their valued life activities. And to me, what goes beyond even empathy, what empathy opens the door for is compassion. When we're not just being sympathetic and understanding, but when we can truly guide, not just by the side, but we can guide people to a place that helps them fulfill their highest potential. And I think that that's something that Brennan, I've seen from watching you how you inspire others. And it's really through your compassion. And a lot of people here don't know, but you worked very closely with somebody who we lost this year, with both Gia and with Kobe. And you work at the with the whole team that she was associated with. And I can think of no more balanced person to ask for your reflections about what Nick is saying and what Kathy is saying about how we need a certain boldness right now. This COVID-19 is an opportunity. The world is never going to be the same. This is unprecedented, a black swan event. Can we make this knowledge translation stick? What are your thoughts about what we can do as from compassion to help pave the way?
Well, first, I'd like to genuinely say thank you for that type of introduction and reflection itself. And, you know, I've been lucky to spend a lot of time with yourself. A lot of the people that you bring alongside Nick, I'm very grateful to have learned besides you a few times through your relationship with Equinox, and all of these things tend to cultivate how I feel the current context is and the future purpose of what we can be and why and how we can shape coaching in the future. So I just want to kind of bring it all full circle as I've been listening this whole time. So a couple things that I reflect back on, you know, when I think about undergraduate, graduate school, and Nick, you just brought up how this needs to be in literature. This needs to be applied in a lot of different mediums and avenues within continued education, learning, and application within coaching, because I totally agree and see it through the outcomes with my clients to this day. But it's, you know, I think back to motor learning in graduate school and this quick, you know, brush over of how cueing, you know, through Gabriel Wolf's studies, just kind of, they get memorialized, but, you know, not dive in, not a deep dive to what we could really be applying as coaches. And I didn't really know this until I started to coach and realized that I was not connecting in that sense of autonomy and mastery of movement for my clients, the athletes, anybody that I was able to work with. But through, especially work that Craig and Nick, both of you have led people like myself through, I realized that the application of this gets really emphasized in a time like right now. So I wanted to bring it to this current context that we're in within virtual training. And Ryan, you had said something as far as how this really exposes what your relationship might be and the true mastery that our clients have had. So a couple of things that you just brought out to light. Craig, you just brought out compassion and empathy. I mean, that's a huge thing that gets shined to light when suddenly we're all working from home, including working with our clients and our patients, our athletes, however you want to describe them, are human beings. In this, you know, different time that might be very confusing, and everybody's going through their own perspective of what is challenging to them. So that compassion and empathy definitely gets brought out to light on not only how you handle yourself currently, but how you've laid the groundwork on continuing to build rapport and build a relationship that is genuine within a mutual understanding. The last thing I wanted to bring up was when you're going through virtual training, as far as these sessions go, external cueing, environmental constraints, and coaching intention are the pinnacle for value right now as I continue to adjust around whatever the client has, using that environment, you know, having fun with where they're at in their home. Maybe their kids by them, they have a kayak behind them, that painting that's off to their right. You start to use these things, but also coaching that intention really brings the value of whatever sacrifice they might be making within their equipment. And we know the limitations that everybody's going through right now. But I gotta say, everything that Nick had really led through, and what I can't wait to dive into the book about is really getting highlighted right now. And it's just going to continue to be something that every coach, if they want to sustain strong relationships as the future continues on, it's really going to be through how we coach, not about what we coach. So I think this time really emphasizes what you all have bravely inflicted and really educated a lot of us on. So I'm sorry that was very long-winded,
No,
but
that's perfect.
it just kept layering on. And I just think all this is so wonderful to be a part of.
Brennan, thank you. It's very meaningful to have you here with us. And for those that don't know, as I mentioned, Brennan's one of the top of all the Tier X, which is the highest level coaches in the Equinox ecosystem, but also has worked at a high level with a number of athletes. And you know, we've had a rough year, COVID, and of course that was on the heels of the tragedy with Kobe and Gia and the other people traveling in that helicopter, which very well you could have been on, Brennan. What do you take from these ideas about changing an industry and changing the musculoskeletal space, the performance space, as Kathy is suggesting, and Nick is not just encouraging but exhorting us, from your experience with Kobe about his ability. You know, we hear a lot about the Mamba mentality, but I also bore witness a little bit to his mindset. What can you share with us as a legacy from Kobe, as far as his willingness to research and to study, and as Nick is saying, to be like the PhD, not to have the label, the letters after your name, but to really be a learn-it-all and just to keep learning, because that's what I took from getting to know him to some degree. But you got to know him a lot more. How do you reflect on that aspect as a legacy from Kobe?
Yes, you know, it's
I know it's raw.
true. No, I love it, and you know, I'd like to actually relate it to Kathy and how Nick both are when, you know, we bring this all full circle. And a couple things that we can all note on this webinar, you know, something that we're not in person feeling the energies between each other. You can note conviction. You can note the intention that they speak about on what is really needing to be elevated is our language, but also how our body language is being expressed and received. Because in Kathy's work, this is unspoken, but this is a certain representation and an intention that is unquestioned, and it doesn't need to be spoken of. And why I bring that up is because that would be one thing that initially just comes to mind, although there's honestly a million things that I could speak of this man, but his convictions in what was desired to be achieved along the spectrum of a daily achievement, a lifestyle achievement. To be honest with you, all of them seem to carry the same weight. And that really noticed a certain presence in the present moment, because all of them were equally as important. And although the list of notable achievements that he had were unquestioned, I think also some of the things that just happened on a day-to-day basis held just as much weight. So that conviction in his goals were really unquestioned, but therefore that brought a lot of direct and unquestioned intentions within what the demands were for whatever that achievement was. And there was no semblance of a victim's mentality in whatever the demands were. When you speak of what you want to do, it becomes a tireless pursuit that some people may not understand, and it may take a long time for a larger gathering to really show what this means. And I think that's what we're speaking about right now. How do we get this to move the needle into where this is just a standard for all coaches. This isn't some secret sauce or anything like that. This is something that all coaches understand and really take a lot of account into. And I think that's something that on a daily discussion, there wasn't communication that had a lack of conviction, especially when we're talking about things that wanted to be achieved. And the intention and the actions that carry out from that are every bit as valuable when you see it, because you truly believe that this is what wants to be achieved. And I believe that the people that are on this webinar right now, taking this time on their Sunday, as well as Nick, Craig, and then Kathy for jumping in, this is what really shows the intention of what coaching can truly be. And this is part of that how that brings a human element.
Wow. So Brennan, thank you so much. We're right up against the end now. We started a couple minutes late. I feel like your comments, Brennan, take us right back to something you said before, Nick, about when you were in the combine year one and your head was down and you weren't getting the connection. And I think this sense of presence that emerges from the attitude of conviction, to be present and have all that intent. It just seems like exactly what Brendan is talking about that he saw in Kobe on a day-to-day basis is exactly what you realized was absent, even though you had all of the right ideas. And that jolted you into taking on a whole new way of approaching your work, your craft, your art, Nick. And I just see a symmetry to what Brennan just said and what you started us off with as far as how you were jettisoned forward in your journey. But Nick, I'm going to let you have the final remarks. I want to thank you for joining us, and I'm going to let you take it out, Nick. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you, and thanking Brennan for such vulnerability and honesty. Beautiful, well put to give us insights there. So thank you for doing that. As Brennan was talking, it reminded me of the story that I wanted to share, Craig, and how you've been talking so eloquently about this importance of connection and empathy and understanding and compassion. And for me, I realized that through coaching movement, through the natural occurrence of the way we coach movement, we can imbue so many of our words implicitly with these connection points, these I see you points, I hear you points, I'm here for you points. And I'd like to share a story from when I hadn't been a personal trainer more than a year. And when I look back, I think this story is a perfect way to tie everything we've talked about together. And it's one I've been sharing and only now can truly appreciate. So I was sitting down with a middle-aged man who wanted to just improve his general fitness. And as you do, you go through and you talk about goals and, aspirations, their why, or the it, as Mark Verstegen likes to say. And I said, what's your goal? And what he proceeded to tell me, I had never heard to that point, nor have I ever heard a similar answer, but it was beautiful. And he said, what you have to understand is I'm separated from my wife, and we have a 5-year-old son, and my son lives with my wife, or my former wife. And my son has a picture of Superman on his wall. He has a Superman poster. And he's like, my son absolutely loves and looks up to Superman. And I want to do everything I can, mind, body, and soul, to be that Superman for my son. And I could tell there was pain, even though I was quite young at the time. I probably couldn't fully appreciate it. Now being a father, I can understand it quite a bit. But there was pain behind the comment, almost as if he was reflecting that he hadn't been that. And this was part of his journey to become that. And Superman was the analogy, was the basis that he would reference in terms of his goals and what he would want to be like for his son. And so I banked that, not knowing what I would do with it. It's quite emotional. I think I would have been far better equipped now to deal with that person in that moment than I was then. but I did something unique nonetheless. And that is, we were 2 or 3 sessions in, and we were working on an RDL, single leg RDL. Everyone knows it. And we all know when we're teaching that movement, a lot of people struggle to keep straight spine and all that good stuff. And so I probably was throwing out every internal cue in the book. And then I remembered Superman. And I said, okay, on your next repetition, as you go down, I want you to get in that long position, like Superman going off the building, catching Lois Lane. Show me Superman at the bottom. And he grabs the weights, almost shaking a little bit, and he goes through the movement, and kind of like those pictures you showed, Craig, just locks in, light bulbs it. He stands up, and he's crying. And he says, thank you. And it was in that moment, I felt the knowledge. I couldn't articulate the knowledge, but I felt the knowledge that I can now articulate. And that is, I used to think that I coach movement. And now I realize I coach people through movement. And each one of those cues is an opportunity to connect. It's an opportunity to take their story, their lived life, and leverage that information, leverage their familiar to teach them the unfamiliar. And in taking the familiar to teach the unfamiliar, we are able to help them get one step closer to a goal, but doing so through the language of their lived experience, through their life. And that creates a net outcome that not only are they better movers, but they see someone who truly cares and wants to help them achieve that ultimate goal. And it creates a holistic experience that is hard to describe, but the richness leaves them with a simple feeling of, I want to come back. And so cues are more than language to improve movement. They truly are the ways to connect us and move us forward.
Beautiful. Wow. You just gave me chills, Nick. On that note, I know we've run over. I want to thank Ryan and Aaron and Geronimo, of course, Nick and Kathy and Brennan, and all of you from all over the world. Kylie from South Africa, Jackie from China, Alex from Hong Kong, Hangjin from Korea. We have people from all over the world here. Thanks for joining our circle, our community, and hope to see you next week and the week after. And the week after, we'll finish with Nick then as the 10th webinar. All of these will be on the YouTube channel, and everybody go and high five somebody virtually who is socially distanced, the elderly, who we can't see, we can't hold. We can still do the virtual high five with them. So thank you guys very, very, very much, and have a wonderful rest of your Sunday. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah,
No,
no
awesome,
worries.
Nick.
No worries.
Thank you so
Just
much.
in time as my little guy came in to photobomb us. In fairness, he's been quite patient. I'm in their downstairs area. So
we have people signing off one by one. Thanks, Christina. And I'll send you the date.
yeah, great.
That's fantastic that you can do it. I really appreciate it.
No worries. This was a lot of fun. I like this. I like the way you went about this, the inclusivity of it. I don't like the just singular one-directional questions. I like the discussion. And obviously,
Good.
Craig, it's always great to learn from you and Ryan and others who you chimed in. You know, it was almost like a little bit of a guest show. You had some impromptu guests. I think the whole thing was awesome.
Alan Wong wants to know about ebook. You got an ebook, don't you?
Yeah, it's ebook. Obviously, from a content perspective, one-to-one. But for those, let's call them kinesthetic people, I think having the physical book, you know, the way it's designed, it's going to be, for me, it's going to be a better experience. And I've written it in a way so people can write inside of it. It prompts you to do that. You can do that with Kindle, but I think the physical copy is going to be the one that wins out for me.
The physical copy looked amazing. I see Pasquale was here. Thank you, Pasquale. Jim thanks us. Bean, Sabrina, thank you. Marianne DMAC. Wow, we've you held on to the audience pretty well, Nick.
Oh, okay. Well, good.
2 hour long form like this is is a long haul. I feel like we're doing a Joe Rogan thing.
We are. I love Joe. But Craig, I do have a little one there in the back. So unless I'm going to jump off, if that's okay. So good to see you guys, and look forward to coming back on with you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Be
much.
safe in the
Take care.
meantime. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.